In the heart of Maplewood Lane, where each house stood like a friendly neighbor in perfect harmony, lived Jake Thompson, a laid-back guy with an unmatched enthusiasm for weekend car washes. With a carefree spirit and a keen eye for detail, Jake transformed his driveway into a personal detailing studio each Saturday morning. Armed with a bucket of warm, soapy water and a well-loved sponge, he found joy in the simple ritual of polishing his cherry-red sedan to a shine that could rival any showroom. Jake's weekends contrasted sharply with those of his neighbor, Mrs. Gladys Whitaker. An emblem of uptight perfectionism, her every concern revolved around the neighborhood's aesthetic and environmental sanctity. With a penchant for surveillance from behind her lace curtains, Gladys viewed herself as the self-appointed guardian of cleanliness and order in Maplewood. Any deviation from her rigid standards ignited her indignation, and it was often clear from her disapproving huffs and irritated tuts that she believed she held the moral high ground. On this particularly sunny Saturday, as Jake splashed water playfully while singing along to his favorite tunes, Gladys glowered from her window. Each bubble that popped and each droplet that landed on the pavement seemed to send her into a deeper spiral of irritation. To her, Jake's harmless hobby was not just an inconvenience, it threatened to tarnish the pristine reputation she had meticulously cultivated for their street. Unable to restrain herself any longer, she picked up her phone with determination. In her mind, this act wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about saving their neighborhood from what she imagined to be an impending environmental disaster fueled by soapsuds and water runoff. With a huff of indignation, she dialed 911, convinced she was undertaking an act of civic duty rather than indulging in sheer nosiness. Maplewood Lane was the kind of suburb that seemed plucked from a postcard: idyllic tree-lined streets, neatly manicured lawns, and houses adorned with cheerful flower beds. Each home stood proudly, reflecting the personalities of their owners: pastel-colored exteriors, charming shutters, and picket fences that invited friendly waves from passing neighbors. On weekends, children played in the yards while the air filled with laughter and the scent of barbecues wafted through the open windows. It was a place where community spirit thrived, and everyone knew each other by name. Yet amidst this picturesque setting loomed Mrs. Gladys Whitaker, a figure whose presence felt more like a storm cloud than a neighborly glow. With a well-practiced scowl etched on her face, she surveyed the street with hawk-like vigilance from behind her lace curtains. To her, the tranquility of Maplewood Lane was a fragile facade that required constant upkeep and vigilance. Every stray leaf that fell or misplaced garden gnome that appeared sent her into a tizzy, and she had made it her mission to uphold the neighborhood's perceived perfection at any cost. While Jake washed his car under the warm golden sun, singing along to his favorite tunes, Gladys viewed his carefree happiness as an affront to her rigid standards. The gentle sound of water splashing and birds chirping clashed with her internal alarm bells ringing loudly at what she considered a disturbance. How could anyone allow such chaos on the pristine streets of Maplewood? As she watched him scrub away without a care in the world, she felt the oppressive weight of her self-imposed rules suffocating her senses. In her mind, each bubble bursting on the pavement became a guilty secret threatening the sanctity of their beloved neighborhood. Fueled by exaggerated concerns, she steeled herself for action, convinced that only she could restore order to this seemingly blissful chaos. On that sun-soaked Saturday morning, Jake Thompson rolled out of bed with a bounce in his step, ready to embrace his ritual of washing his beloved cherry-red sedan. The sky was an endless expanse of blue, dotted with cotton candy clouds that seemed to cheer him on as he stepped into the driveway, wearing a pair of worn-out shorts and a faded t-shirt that had seen better days. With the radio crackling softly in the background, he grabbed his bucket and filled it with warm, soapy water, the steam rising enticingly in the crisp morning air. As he began to scrub the car's surface, Jake couldn't help but feel a wave of contentment wash over him. Each stroke of the sponge sent flecks of foam dancing into the air, glimmering in the sunlight like tiny diamonds. He sang along to his favorite tunes, his voice echoing through the otherwise quiet street, a melody of carefree joy that perfectly matched the day. With every rinse and polish, Jake lost himself in the simple pleasure of the task. He admired the gleam on his car and took pride in making it shine. The rhythmic sound of water splashing against metal was soothing, a reminder of how small moments could bring such happiness. Neighborhood kids paused their bike riding to wave at him, their laughter mingling with the gentle sounds of nature all around. However, from her watchful post behind the lace curtains, Mrs. Gladys Whitaker's mood darkened further with each bubble that popped and each droplet that splattered onto the pavement. What she perceived as a joyful activity quickly morphed into an affront to her meticulously maintained neighborhood. Each cheerful note from Jake's singing felt like nails on a chalkboard to her ears. The carefree scene unraveled her tightly held sense of order, igniting an irritation that would soon compel her to take action against what she deemed chaos in their perfect suburb. As Jake continued to wash his car, oblivious to the brewing storm just a few houses down, Mrs. Gladys Whitaker became increasingly agitated. From her vantage point behind the lace curtains, she watched him with growing disdain, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Each splash of water and cheerful note of his singing grated on her nerves like an incessant alarm clock. How could he not see the chaos he was unleashing upon their pristine street? Her mind raced through a litany of exaggerated concerns: soap bubbles drifting into the storm drain, excessive water runoff seeping into the earth, and potential environmental damage unfolding right before her eyes. In Gladys's world, every drop of soapy water represented a small act of rebellion against the orderly life she had worked so hard to create. The very thought made her blood boil. What if these chemicals spread? What if it attracts pests? She muttered to herself, each hypothetical scenario further fueling her indignation. She imagined her fellow neighbors sharing in her horror at the unchecked disturbance unfolding before them. After all, Maplewood Lane was known for its immaculate lawns and meticulously cared-for homes, a realm where any deviation from perfection threatened to unravel the very fabric of their community. Compelled by a sense of duty that bordered on obsession, she snatched her phone from the coffee table with shaky hands. This wasn't just about Jake washing his car, this was about safeguarding the environment and protecting their beloved neighborhood from neglect. She dialed 911, framing her complaint as an environmental crisis rather than a mere annoyance. "This is an emergency," she insisted to the dispatcher, her voice dripping with urgency as she reported what she believed to be a serious offense. "There's a man washing his car. It's creating pollution and could harm our neighborhood." With each word, she fortified her convictions, convinced that only she had the power to restore order to Maplewood Lane. Moments after Mrs. Gladys Whitaker's call, 2 police officers arrived on Maplewood Lane, their cruiser gliding to a stop in front of Jake's driveway. Officer Martinez, a seasoned veteran with a hint of a smirk tugging at his lips, stepped out first, followed closely by Officer Jenkins, who looked both puzzled and amused by the unfolding situation. They exchanged glances, unsure of what to expect as they approached the vibrant cherry-red sedan gleaming in the sunlight. "All right, let's see what we have here," Officer Martinez said, trying to maintain an air of professionalism while suppressing a chuckle at the absurdity of the call. As they got closer, Jake stood there with his sponge in hand, completely unaware of the chaotic whirlwind brewing just moments prior. His friendly demeanor and upbeat music seemed to clash with the seriousness of the officer's visit. "Good morning, sir." Officer Martinez greeted Jake, adopting a tone that was both warm and slightly bewildered. "We received a call about some concerns regarding your car washing?" Jake raised an eyebrow, still dripping wet from the sudsy task. "Car washing? Is that illegal now?" he replied, an incredulous smile spreading across his face. Officer Jenkins stepped forward, trying to clarify. "Well, it seems there was a report about potential pollution from soap and water runoff." His voice trailed off as he noted Jake's quizzical expression. The sheer absurdity of the complaint was evident to both officers as they exchanged another glance. "What are we talking about here? Environmental crisis or a weekend car wash?" Officer Martinez asked playfully, shaking his head in disbelief. Despite the unusual nature of the call, they both knew they had to handle it with care. They began asking polite questions about Jake's process, all while trying to suppress their laughter at the surreal situation unfolding before them. It was quickly becoming clear that this was less a law enforcement matter and more an exercise in patience. As Officer Martinez and Officer Jenkins settled into the investigation, they turned to Jake, who was now leaning against his car, sponge still in hand. "So, Jake," Officer Jenkins began with a slight grin, "can you tell us what exactly you're doing here today?" "Washing my car," Jake replied, looking genuinely surprised that such a simple activity could warrant police attention. "Is that illegal?" Officer Martinez chuckled softly. "Not at all, but we received a call from a neighbor who was concerned about potential pollution from soap and water runoff." He gestured toward the driveway with an eyebrow raised. "You know how it is in neighborhoods like this, some folks take things a bit too seriously." Jake shook his head, laughter bubbling in his throat. "Pollution? From washing my car? I mean, come on. It's just soap and water. Plus, I'm careful to wash it here and not let anything go down the storm drain. The officers exchanged knowing looks, well aware of the absurdity they were navigating. Well, we just want to make sure everything is all right, Officer Jenkins said, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the growing hilarity of the situation. Could you show us how you typically rinse off? Sure. Jake replied enthusiastically. He demonstrated his method, carefully rinsing off the soap while explaining how he directed the runoff away from the street and toward the grass. See? No harm done here. Officer Martinez nodded approvingly. Looks like you've got this under control, he said, stifling a laugh. Just so you know, there are no laws being violated. Washing your car is perfectly legal. Glad to hear it. Jake smiled, relieved. So I can continue my Saturday ritual without fear of being arrested? Absolutely, Officer Jenkins assured him, sharing a friendly grin. But we might suggest considering a bucket over the hose next time, just to keep everyone happy. Both officers chuckled at this suggestion, and Jake laughed along, feeling grateful for their light-hearted approach amidst the bizarre circumstances. Just as the officers wrapped up their conversation with Jake, Mrs. Gladys Whitaker stormed out of her house, her expression a mix of indignation and urgency. This is the very definition of irresponsible behavior, she exclaimed, arms flailing for emphasis as she approached the scene. The energy shifted instantly. Jake's relaxed demeanor faded as he caught sight of her fierce approach. Excuse me, officers. I hope you're not going to let him get away with this environmental catastrophe, she said, breathless with frustration. Do you have any idea what he's doing to our neighborhood? Soap and water runoff could seep into the ground and cause irreparable damage. Officer Martinez raised an eyebrow, struggling to maintain a straight face while he listened to her rant. Ma'am, we've discussing your neighbor's activity and it seems to be within legal limits. Limits? What limits? Gladys cut him off, completely undeterred. This isn't just some trivial matter. One day it's washing a car, next thing you know, we're on a downhill slope leading to ecological disaster. Think of the children, what if they breathe in pollutants from his soapy spray? It's irresponsible. Jake glanced at the officers, incredulous at her exaggerated claims. I'm literally using biodegradable soap, he interjected, trying to defend himself against her overblown allegations. Gladys clasped her hands in disbelief. That's exactly what they all say. It's about setting a precedent here on Maplewood Lane. If he gets away with this today, what will happen tomorrow? She pointed dramatically at Jake's driveway and then at the street, as if illustrating some grand crime scene for her audience. Officer Jenkins exchanged another baffled look with Martinez before stepping forward in an attempt to handle the situation calmly. Mrs. Whitaker, while we appreciate your concern for community standards, it's important to note that washing your car is certainly allowed and encouraged so long as no laws are broken. But think of the aesthetics. Gladys protested vehemently, clearly more concerned about appearances than any real threat. As she continued her impassioned speech about neighborhood decorum, Jake couldn't help but roll his eyes at the ridiculousness of it all. It was hard not to find humor in her passionate yet misplaced zeal. Officer Jenkins cleared his throat, determined to address Mrs. Whitaker's concerns with a calm demeanor. Ma'am, we understand that you have strong feelings about keeping the neighborhood pristine, he began. But washing a car on your own property is not just common practice, it's entirely legal. Plenty of residents do it every weekend. Gladys's eyes widened in disbelief as she waved her arms dramatically. But what about the soap? What if the runoff damages our precious plants? We can't just sweep those concerns under the rug. Actually, Officer Martinez interjected with a reassuring smile, many soaps we use today are biodegradable and designed not to harm the environment. They break down naturally, unlike some of the other things we see out there in the wild, like those weeds in your flower bed. He pointed playfully at her garden, eliciting a momentary look of confusion from Gladys before he continued. And besides, Officer Jenkins added with a chuckle, how many times have you driven down the street behind someone who just cleaned their car? I think we can both agree that it's not just acceptable but can provide a certain, how should I say it, sparkle to our lovely neighborhood. Jake stood nearby, trying his best to suppress his laughter at the absurdity of it all. Exactly. In fact, I could even offer you a free wash sometime if you're interested. Gladys scowled but couldn't fully ignore Jake's good-natured banter. This isn't funny. We have standards to uphold. Of course, and we appreciate your passion for maintaining those standards, Officer Martinez replied diplomatically. But you might want to rethink what standards really means. It's perfectly acceptable for Jake to wash his car here. In fact, it contributes to community spirit. As the officers exchanged amused glances, the humor of the situation began to sink in for Mrs. Whitaker as well. Despite her efforts to maintain decorum, she had inadvertently become part of a rather ridiculous scene, leaving her to reconsider if it was worth her while to escalate matters any further. As the situation unfolded, a small crowd of curious neighbors began to gather around Jake's driveway, drawn by the commotion and the sight of police cars parked on their normally tranquil street. Whispers filled the air, blending with laughter as onlookers exchanged bewildered glances. Some were genuinely amused by Mrs. Gladys Whitaker's dramatic flair, while others shook their heads in disbelief at her antics. Is this really happening? One neighbor murmured to another, struggling to suppress a chuckle. She called the police because someone is washing their car? What next? A SWAT team for gardening. Across the way, Bob, who had lived on Maplewood Lane for over a decade, couldn't hold back his laughter as he chimed in, I've been living here for years and I've never seen soapsuds being treated like public enemy number one. Gladys has finally lost it. Meanwhile, Gladys stood there with her arms crossed, clearly feeling the weight of scrutiny from her fellow residents. Her face flushed with indignation as she tried to regain control of the narrative. This isn't a joke. We have standards in this community that must be upheld. She shouted, but her voice lacked the conviction it once held as more neighbors rolled their eyes in response. Officer Jenkins attempted to lighten the mood further. Ma'am, he said with an easy smile, if we start arresting people for washing their cars on Saturday mornings, we might just have to draw up an entirely new police manual. The crowd erupted in laughter at the absurdity. Even Jake joined in on the fun. Maybe I should charge admission for future washes, he quipped, winking at his newfound audience. The tension that had enveloped the scene slowly evaporated as laughter filled the air. What had started as a tense confrontation transformed into an impromptu neighborhood gathering where even Gladys couldn't help but feel a little ridiculous amidst the humor surrounding her. As whispers turned into chuckles and light-hearted banter spread through the crowd, Mrs. Whitaker's passion seemed less righteous and more comical. Perched on her high horse of decorum, she now looked every bit the overzealous neighbor desperately clinging to an outdated idea of neighborhood rules amidst a wave of cheerful camaraderie. As the laughter subsided, Officer Martinez exchanged glances with Officer Jenkins, ready to wrap up their unusual visit. All right, folks, Martinez announced, addressing the gathered neighbors. I think we can all agree that washing a car on one's own property isn't breaking any laws here. He turned to Mrs. Whitaker with a reassuring smile. And while we appreciate your concern for the community, we suggest you save your calls for actual emergencies. Gladys huffed but remained silent, her earlier fervor dissipating amidst the collective amusement around her. The officers began walking back toward their cruiser as neighbors started clapping and cheering lightly, turning what had been an awkward confrontation into a moment of unity. Jake couldn't help but grin as he wiped down the last spots of his car. Thanks for having my back. He called out to the officers, who responded with friendly waves as they got into their vehicle. Maybe next time I'll set up a car wash competition, Jake joked to those lingering nearby, eliciting more laughter from the onlookers. One neighbor leaned in and quipped, I can already see it, Maplewood Lane's annual soapsuds showdown. As the officers drove away, chatter erupted among residents about how the incident would be recounted at future block parties and gatherings, each telling embellished more than the last. It was a classic neighborhood story that would be passed down through future generations of Maplewood Lane's residents. I can't believe Gladys called the police over this, another neighbor chimed in with a chuckle. What are we going to do next? Call them for someone watering their garden? The absurdity of it all had transformed into light-hearted banter that strengthened their community bonds. In that moment, what began as an embarrassment for Jake and a display of overzealousness from Gladys cemented itself as a legendary tale within Maplewood Lane, a reminder that sometimes the most mundane activities could lead to unexpected camaraderie and laughter amongst neighbors.